On the streets of London, where tradition stands taller than power, one man learned a lesson no authority could erase. When Vladimir Putin demanded a royal guard step aside, expecting obedience, he was met with silence and unshakable defiance. What followed wasn't just a standoff. It was a reminder that true strength lies in duty, not dominance. Before we dive into this, hit the subscribe button and tell us from where in the world you're watching from. If you will, London, on a November morning when the sky weeps gentle tears upon the ancient stones, the Thames flows like liquid pewter, carrying the dreams and sorrows of 10 million souls toward the waiting sea. Above this river of time stands Buckingham Palace, that great monument to continuity, where history breathes in the very walls. On this particular morning, the palace stirred with unusual energy, not the joyful bustle of celebration, but the taut, electric tension that precedes a thunderstorm. For coming to call was a man whose very name sent ripples across the pond of international relations. Vladimir Putin, that enigmatic figure who had transformed from a shadow in the intelligence services to the sun around which a vast nation orbited. The preparations were meticulous, orchestrated like a sacred ritual. Every step had been measured, every word rehearsed, every protocol examined under the harsh light of diplomatic necessity. Yet beneath this veneer of civilized pageantry lay something deeper, something that made the very air itself seem to thrum with anticipation. In the guardhouse, as dawn painted the sky in watercolor pastels, Lance Corporal Thomas readily prepared for what he believed would be another day of ceremonial duty. At 28, Thomas carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had looked death in the face and found it wanting. His eyes, grey as the English Channel on a winter's day, held depths that spoke of battlefields far from home, of moments when courage was not a choice but a necessity. As he donned his scarlet tunic with its golden braiding, Thomas performed a ritual as old as duty itself. Each button fastened was a vow renewed. Each adjustment of his bearskin hat was a prayer to something larger than himself. He was not merely putting on a costume, he was clothing himself in the very essence of service. "Today," whispered his soul, though he could not yet know why, "today will test what manner of man you truly are." When power incarnate arrived at the palace gates, it came not with trumpets and fanfare, but with the quiet, deadly efficiency of a predator. The motorcade moved like a school of dark fish through the London streets, each vehicle a fortress of steel and bulletproof glass. Inside the lead car sat a man who had transformed himself from mere mortal into something approaching myth. Putin emerged from his armored cocoon with movements precise as clockwork, economical as winter itself. Here was a man who understood that every gesture was a statement, every glance a declaration. His pale eyes, chips of Arctic ice, surveyed the palace grounds, not as a tourist might admire architecture, but as a chess master studies the board before the opening move. The British officials, polished smooth by decades of diplomatic protocol, greeted their guest with smiles that never quite reached their eyes. They spoke in the ancient language of statecraft, words carefully chosen, meanings layered like geological strata, each phrase carrying the weight of nations. As the official party began their tour through the palace's storied halls, they passed beneath oil paintings of long-dead monarchs who gazed down with expressions of eternal judgment. Here hung the faces of those who had ruled by divine right, who had believed themselves answerable only to God and history. The irony was not lost on Putin, who had crafted his own form of divine authority in the halls of the Kremlin. Room by room they progressed, past treasures that spoke of empire's golden age, past tapestries that told stories of conquest and glory. But with each step, the Russian leader's patience grew thinner, his movements more deliberate. For Vladimir Putin was a man accustomed to the world arranging itself for his convenience. Two doors opening before he reached them, two obstacles melting away like snow in spring. He was about to discover that some things, once planted, cannot be moved. In the West Gallery, where morning light filtered through tall windows like benediction through cathedral glass, Thomas Redley had taken his position. His post was precise, measured to the inch by centuries of tradition. Here he stood, a living pillar in the architecture of ceremony, as fixed and permanent as the marble columns that supported the roof above. To understand what happened next, you must first understand what it means to be a guard. Thomas was not merely a soldier in fancy dress, not a museum piece for tourist photographs. He was the embodiment of something eternal, the principle that some things are sacred, some promises unbreakable, some duties absolute. His training had been thorough, his indoctrination complete. "You are not a man on duty," his sergeant had told him in those early days. "You are duty itself made flesh. You are the crown's will made manifest in the world. When you take your post, you cease to be Thomas Redley of Sheffield. You become something greater. You become the promise that some things endure." And so he stood, breathing slowly, eyes fixed on infinity, his mind a still pond reflecting only duty. Around him, the palace hummed with activity, but he was separate from it all, existing in a space between the temporal and the eternal. The tour group approached from the east corridor, their footsteps echoing on marble worn smooth by centuries of such processions. Thomas sensed their approach, not with his eyes, which remained fixed ahead, but with that deeper awareness that soldiers develop in dangerous places. He registered their presence the way a mountain registers the wind, acknowledging without yielding as they drew nearer. The energy in the air seemed to thicken, like the atmosphere before lightning strikes. The British officials maintained their pleasant chatter, pointing out historical details and architectural features, but their voices carried an undertone of nervous tension. They could feel it too, the approaching convergence of immovable object and irresistible force. Putin walked among them like a shark among minnows, his attention seemingly focused on the guide's explanations, while his hunter's instincts catalogued every detail of his surroundings. He noted the positions of security personnel, the locations of exits, the sight lines and approach vectors. Old habits from his intelligence days died hard, and then he saw him, the guard, standing like a scarlet exclamation point in the flowing sentence of the corridor. "I have learned, my dear ones, that the most profound victories are often the quietest ones. They come not with thunder and lightning, but with the gentle persistence of water wearing away stone. They arrive not as conquering armies, but as simple truth standing naked in a world clothed in deception." Putin's pale eyes narrowed as he studied the motionless guard. Here was an equation that refused to balance, a variable that would not be solved. In his long climb to power, he had learned to read men like books, to find their weaknesses, their pressure points, their braking mechanisms. But Thomas Redley presented no obvious leverage. He was not motivated by greed, for he had taken a vow of service. He was not driven by ambition, for he sought no higher office than the one he now held. He was not afraid of consequences, for he had already accepted the ultimate consequence, the possibility of death in service to something greater than himself. The Russian leader found himself in uncharted territory. This was not politics, where every man had his price. This was not business, where every deal could be negotiated. This was not warfare, where superior force inevitably triumphed. This was something else entirely, something that belonged to an older world, a realm where honor mattered more than advantage, where principle outweighed pragmatism. For perhaps the first time in decades, Vladimir Putin encountered something he could not bend to his will through the sheer force of his authority. The guard stood like a lighthouse in a storm, unmoved by the hurricane of power that raged around him. A ripple of something, surprise, confusion, perhaps even admiration, passed across Putin's features. It was gone so quickly that most observers missed it entirely, but it was there. The hairline crack in the armor of absolute certainty. The momentary glimpse of the man beneath the myth. The silence stretched toward the breaking point. Security personnel shifted nervously, uncertain whether they were witnessing a diplomatic incident or something approaching a personal crisis for their leader. The British officials looked like men watching a slow-motion car accident, helpless to prevent the collision but unable to look away. And still Thomas stood, still as stone, silent as prayer, immovable as the faith that anchored his soul to something larger than the moment. In that crystalline moment of perfect tension, Vladimir Putin made a choice that revealed the true depth of his strategic mind. A lesser man might have escalated, might have ordered his security to physically remove the obstacle. A more brittle ego might have demanded satisfaction, regardless of the diplomatic cost. But Putin was neither lesser nor brittle. He was a grand master, and grandmasters know when a position is untenable. With movements as fluid as mercury, he stepped back, not in defeat, for Putin did not retreat, but in acknowledgement of a reality that even he could not reshape. The guard was not an opponent to be defeated, but a force of nature to be navigated around. Like a mountain climber faced with an impassable cliff, Putin simply chose a different route. Without a word, without even a glance back at the motionless Thomas, he turned toward the alternative path. His entourage, trained to read the subtlest shifts in their leader's mood, flowed around him like water finding a new channel. The procession resumed, the conversations picked up their threads, the diplomatic dance continued as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. In those few moments of perfect silence, the world had witnessed something extraordinary. Not a confrontation, for Thomas had never moved to confront. Not a victory, for no battle had been fought. Instead, they had seen something rarer and more precious, the quiet triumph of principle over power, of duty over dominance. As the official party moved away toward their scheduled photo opportunity, Thomas remained at his post. The corridor grew quiet again, filled only with the soft whisper of his controlled breathing and the distant murmur of London traffic beyond the palace walls. He had not moved. He had not spoken. He had simply been. And in being what he was called to be, he had accomplished something that armies could not achieve, that diplomats could not negotiate, that politicians could not legislate. He had drawn a line in the marble floor of history, and declared, "This far, and no further." My children, never underestimate the power of a single moment of authentic truth. Like a stone dropped in a still pond, such moments send ripples across vast distances, touching shores we cannot even imagine. Word of the encounter spread through the palace like wildfire. It passed from guard to guard in whispered conversations. During shift changes, it reached the ears of senior officials who listened with expressions of wonder and concern. By evening, it had traveled across oceans, reaching the halls of power in Washington, Beijing, Moscow itself. The story grew in the telling, as such stories do. Some versions painted it as a diplomatic crisis averted by quick thinking. Others saw it as a moment of cultural misunderstanding smoothed over by protocol. But those who truly understood saw it for what it was, a glimpse of something eternal breaking through the veil of temporal concerns. In the Kremlin, Putin's advisors waited nervously for his reaction to what they assumed would be perceived as a humiliation, but the Russian leader surprised them, as he so often did. When asked about the incident by a trusted aide, he was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes distant. The man knew his purpose, Putin said finally. In a world of flexibility, he was fixed. In an age of negotiation, he was absolute. There is something to be learned from such certainty. Meanwhile, in the modest flat he shared with his wife, in South London, Thomas Redley sat in his favorite chair, a cup of tea cooling in his hands. He stared out the window at the ordinary street, where ordinary people lived their ordinary lives, and marveled at how the extraordinary could emerge from the most mundane moments. His wife, Sarah, watched him from the doorway. She had seen that look before the 1,000-yard stare of a soldier processing something too large for words. She didn't ask what had happened during his shift. She had learned, during his tours in Afghanistan, that some experiences needed time to settle like sediment in still water before they could be examined clearly. "Everything all right, love?" she asked quietly. Thomas turned to her, his grey eyes clear and peaceful. "Everything's as it should be," he said, and she heard in those simple words the echo of something profound. As the days passed, and the immediate drama of the state visit faded into memory, the true significance of that moment in the corridor began to reveal itself. It was not about politics, though it had political implications. It was not about personalities, though it had involved two compelling figures. It was about something much deeper, the eternal tension between power and principle, between what we can do and what we should do. In the weeks that followed, Thomas found himself assigned to different posts, different duties. His superiors, perhaps sensing that he had become something of a symbol, seemed keen to keep him away from high-profile events. But Thomas didn't mind. He understood that his moment had passed, that his purpose had been fulfilled in those few minutes of perfect stillness. He continued to serve with the same quiet dedication he had always shown. On ceremonial duties, he stood with the same unwavering discipline. During training exercises, he demonstrated the same professional competence. To his fellow guards, he remained simply Thomas, reliable, steady, unremarkable, except for a certain quality of presence that seemed somehow deeper than before. But those who worked closely with him noticed subtle changes. There was a calmness about him now, a sense of completion that hadn't been there before. He had been tested in a crucible unlike any he had ever imagined, and he had not been found wanting. The knowledge gave him a quiet confidence that no external circumstances could shake. In the broader world, the story of the guard who wouldn't move became legend. It appeared in newspapers and magazines, was debated on television talk shows, became the subject of countless social media posts. Some dismissed it as overblown, a minor protocol hiccup, transformed into myth. Others saw it as a perfect metaphor for the clash between old values and new realities. But for those with eyes to see and hearts to understand, it was something else entirely, a reminder that in a world increasingly defined by compromise and accommodation, there still existed pockets of absolute certainty, places where lines were drawn not in sand but in stone, where certain principles remained non-negotiable regardless of the pressure brought to bear upon them. And so, my dear children, we come to the heart of our story, not the external drama of powerful men in ornate rooms, but the internal victory of a soul that knew its purpose and would not be turned from it. Thomas Redley was not a great man in the way the world measures greatness. He commanded no armies, ruled no nations, accumulated no wealth. His name will not appear in history textbooks alongside those of presidents and prime ministers. But in that moment when the most powerful man in the room tried to move him and failed, he achieved something far more precious than fame or fortune. He achieved perfect alignment between his beliefs and his actions, between his values and his choices. This is the lesson whispered in the stones of ancient places, sung in the voices of those who have gone before us. True strength is not the ability to move others, but the wisdom to know when we ourselves must not be moved. Real power is not the capacity to bend the world to our will, but the courage to stand for something larger than ourselves, even when standing seems impossible. In our age of endless flexibility, of situational ethics and pragmatic compromises, Thomas reminds us that some things are worth protecting regardless of the cost. In a time when we are told that everything is negotiable, that all positions are merely starting points for discussion, he shows us the beauty of the non-negotiable, the power of the absolute. Putin, for all his accumulated authority, could not move a single man who knew his place in the cosmic order. Wealth, power, international prestige, none of it mattered when confronted with simple, unwavering certainty. The guard stood not because he was brave, though courage was required. He stood not because he was stubborn, though steadfastness was essential. He stood because he understood something that transcends personality and circumstance. Some things are sacred, some duties are absolute, some promises, once made, cannot be broken. Years have passed since that grey London morning when two philosophies met in a corridor lined with portraits of dead kings. Putin has faced other challenges, other tests of his authority. Thomas has stood other posts, performed other duties. The world has moved on, as it always does, to new crises and fresh controversies, but the echo of that moment continues to reverberate through the chambers of the heart, reminding us that in a universe of constant change, some things endure. Duty endures. Honor endures. The courage to stand for truth endures. In a modest house in South London, Thomas Redley tends his small garden, plays with his children, loves his wife with quiet devotion. He is, by all appearances, an ordinary man living an ordinary life, but those who know how to look can see it still, that quality of unshakable presence, that hint of depths that run deeper than the merely personal. And sometimes, when he stands very still in his garden in the early morning light, watching the sun rise over the great city that has been his life's work to protect, you can almost see him there still, the young guard in his scarlet tunic, standing like a pillar between what was and what would be, reminding us all that some things, once planted, cannot be moved. This is the story I leave with you, my children. In a world that seeks to bend us, to reshape us, to make us conform to its ever-shifting demands, remember the guard who would not move. Remember that true power lies not in the ability to command others, but in the wisdom to know who we are, and the courage to remain faithful to that knowledge. Stand firm, stand true, and when the storms of power and pressure rage around you, remember that you, too, can be immovable when you stand on the solid ground of principle. For in the end, this is what endures, not the empires of the mighty, but the quiet victories of the faithful. The story ends, but the lesson lives forever. In the gentle silence that follows every great truth, the old narrator's voice fades, leaving only the whisper of eternity in the hearts of those who have truly heard. My children, you have walked with me through corridors of marble and shadow, through moments where power flexed its muscle and principle answered with silence. You have seen how the fate of nations can hinge upon a heartbeat, and how eternity itself can hide within the smallest gesture of a man who refuses to move. But the story does not end in that hallway, nor in the years that followed. No, the story breathes still in quiet homes, in the lessons we teach our children, in the way the wind bends the trees while the roots remain deep and unmoved. For what is history, if not the echo of human choices carried forward through time? Let us sit, then, together, and contemplate what remains when the uniforms are folded away, when the portraits of kings fade into dust, when the voices of the powerful are silenced by death. Let us listen for the whisper of eternity that lingers after the story is told. Thomas Redley never sought fame. He never desired his name etched in monuments or his likeness carved into stone. In truth, he wished for nothing more than to serve his duty, return home to Sarah, and hold his children in the embrace of quiet evenings. Yet destiny, as it so often does, found him in the stillness of his post, and used his body as a vessel for something greater. He was, in every sense, an ordinary man, not by weakness, but by design. Ordinary men and women are the fabric of civilization. They are the ones who rise at dawn, who shoulder burdens silently, who live unseen by history books, but whose choices preserve the order of life. When an ordinary man stands immovable, the world takes notice. Why? Because it reminds us that greatness does not belong only to emperors and conquerors. Greatness belongs to anyone who has the courage to live aligned with truth. This is why the story lives on. Not because Thomas Redley was extraordinary in himself, but because he revealed the extraordinary that lies hidden in each of us, waiting to awaken when tested. Consider, my children, what it means to stand. It is the simplest of actions, and yet the hardest. We think of power as movement, armies advancing, leaders commanding, wealth accumulating. But true power is revealed in stillness. Think of the mountain. It does not charge into the valley, nor seek to conquer the sky. It stands. Seasons wash over it, storms pound it, empires rise and fall at its feet. Yet it remains. The mountain is not arrogant, nor ambitious. It is simply faithful to what it is. So too was Thomas. He did not resist Putin with anger or threat. He did not confront with words or weapons. He stood, as the mountain stands, faithful to his oath. His silence was not weakness, it was authority, rooted in eternity. And here lies the paradox. The man with all the power in the room found himself powerless, while the man with no power at all held sway over the moment. This is the silent lesson. The world will tell you that victory belongs to the loud, the aggressive, the flexible who bend to advantage. But there are victories louder than thunder and sharper than swords. They are won not by moving but by remaining. The story of that moment has been told and retold. Some versions shrank it, others exaggerate it. But like a stone cast into water, its ripples continue long after the splash is forgotten. In schools, teachers have used it as a parable about integrity. In barracks, young recruits whisper of it as an example of what it means to wear the uniform with honor. In homes, fathers tell sons and daughters that one day they too may face a moment when the world demands their compromise, and they must remember the guard who did not bend. And though Thomas himself never sought recognition, the story has entered the quiet folklore of our age, not as a tale of Britain or Russia, not as a commentary on politics, but as a universal reminder that within each of us lies the capacity to draw a line the world cannot cross. But let me tell you something. My children, stories are tested not in the moment of telling, but in the centuries that follow. What does it mean, then, for future generations to remember Thomas Redley? Will they see him as a relic of old-fashioned values, a curiosity of a bygone age? Or will they understand that what he embodied is timeless, that the essence of standing firm belongs not to an era, but to eternity itself? Already, the world shifts faster than the eye can follow. Technology remakes societies overnight. Truth itself seems negotiable, traded like currency. Principles bend under the weight of convenience. And yet, even now, the lesson remains. A man who knows his purpose cannot be moved, no matter how fierce the storm. If you listen closely, you will hear echoes of Thomas in every age. You will hear him in the voice of the protester who stands before a line of tanks. You will see him in the nurse who refuses to abandon her patients when disease ravages the land. You will recognize him in the teacher who holds to truth when lies become fashionable. The faces change, the uniforms change, but the stillness endures. In the twilight of his years, Thomas tended his small garden with the same quiet devotion he had once given to the crown. He planted rows of flowers, each bloom a silent prayer. He pruned and watered, not for glory, but because life deserves care. Neighbors would pass by and see nothing more than a man in old clothes, kneeling in the dirt. But those with eyes to see recognized something deeper. The stillness in him remained, like a flame hidden in clay. One day, his youngest child, curious, wide-eyed, full of questions, asked him, "Papa, why do you spend so much time in the garden?" Thomas smiled, brushed the soil from his hands, and answered softly, "Because the garden teaches me what the guardhouse once did, to be faithful, to be patient, to trust that what is planted will endure." And in that answer, my children, lies the secret. Standing firm is not only about resisting tyrants, it is about living faithfully in the ordinary, tending gardens, raising children, honoring vows. These are the true battlegrounds of eternity. Remember that the encounter took place beneath the eyes of forgotten monarchs, whose portraits watched from the gallery walls. Do you not wonder what they whispered in that moment? Perhaps they saw in Thomas what they themselves had once struggled to embody, the burden of representing something greater than oneself. Perhaps they envied him, for in his stillness he achieved what many rulers never could: perfect alignment between duty and being. History, after all, is not kind to kings who compromise principle for expedience. Their empires crumble, their names are tarnished. But the guard who would not move, his legacy endures, because it rests not on conquest, but on faithfulness. Years pass, nations shift, leaders rise and fall, and still the story is told. Children, who never knew the names of presidents or prime ministers, remember the tale of the guard who did not bend. Why? Because it speaks not to the head but to the heart. And when we reach the end of our days, when crowns and titles are stripped away, when wealth and fame mean nothing, what remains? The echo of our choices, the whisper of our stillness. That is eternity, my children. Not the endless march of time, but the resonance of truth carried forward in the souls of those who hear it. And so, as I set down this tale, I leave you with this charge: find your post, and stand. Do not look for greatness in the eyes of men. Look for faithfulness in the sight of eternity. Perhaps your test will not come in a palace corridor, beneath the gaze of kings and predators. Perhaps it will come in a hospital ward, in a courtroom, in a classroom, in the quiet choices of your daily life. Do not think these moments small. Eternity hides in the smallest of them, when the world commands you to bend, to compromise truth for convenience, to abandon principle for advantage. Remember Thomas Redley. Remember the stillness that broke a storm. Stand firm, stand true, and let your life to become an echo that whispers across the ages. Some things cannot be moved,